right, well, good morning, everyone. 안녕하십니까? 환영합니다. It's 10 a.m. here in Washington, D.C., so I do want to welcome our lively in-person group here and also start on time for our large online live stream audience for a very special day, a very special event. And I am really honored. I'm Kathleen Stevens. I'm the president of KEI, and I'm so honored to, along with our KEI staff, to co-host this gathering with the great Korean Embassy here in Washington, D.C. We're here to mark several things. One is, I'm wearing my pin. It's not just my age. It's the 70th anniversary of the U.S. Korea alliance, signed in 1953. And this is one of the events that we're going to use this year to reflect on the past, think about the present, plan the future. And when we think about 1953, of course, it was a pretty desperate and terrible time in the Korean Peninsula with the armistice signed just a couple of months before the mutual defense treaty was signed. The peninsula divided, devastated, families divided. And this mutual treaty was signed. I promise I'm not giving a speech. And I was looking at it's only 2 pages long with like double spacing, much shorter than any document I was ever involved in my. And it actually starts off by saying it's the desire to strengthen the fabric of peace, to strengthen the fabric of peace. And I think we can look back and say for all the difficulties of the past 70 years, it has strengthened the fabric of peace and a lot more. So we want to think about that today and about the big challenges before us now. And we also want to anticipate a very important milestone in our relationship now, the upcoming state visit of President Yoon Suk-yeol to the U.S. next month. And I really appreciate the time of Ambassador Cho and the Korean Embassy. They're going to be very busy. They already are planning for the visit, for joining us today. So we do have a lot of ambassadors here today. I'm reminded of a time when I was a young officer and I was up at the UN and very nervous about a big gathering and I couldn't remember who was who and so on. And my boss just said to me, he said, "Kathy, don't worry. If you can't remember someone's name, just call them ambassador and everybody will turn around." so ambassadors, welcome. And I think I can say, and I never speak for these are some of my Hubei and Sunday on the stage here, and we'll all have a lot to say, probably too much, but I think I can speak for all of us in saying how fortunate we feel to have been witnesses to the extraordinary journey of the Republic of Korea's modern rise, to the building of this relationship, and in some ways to have contributed to it, I hope. But we are really pleased and especially honored to be joined today by Korea's ambassador to the United States, His Excellency Ambassador Cho Tae-young. South Korea, as all of you know who know South Korea, always send their very, very best to Washington. I hope that's the same about us, but certainly true here. And Ambassador Cho, with a distinguished career as a diplomat, as a politician, as a builder of this alliance, is the right person at the right time here. So, Ambassador Cho, I invite you to say a few words, and then we thank you very much for joining this panel of formers. Thank you.
Okay. Do I use this?
Yeah, they want you to.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's truly a great honor and pleasure to be here this morning among the most distinguished American diplomats who helped develop the alliance between the Republic of Korea and the United States of America for the past decades. It's truly an honor for me. So, Kathy, thank you very much for your very, very, very kind introduction. Ambassador Hubbard, Ambassador Vershbow, well, Ambassador Harris, and I'm sure that Ambassador Goldwald will be joining us virtually from Seoul, and Ambassador Yoon, and who will be moderating this session. So it's a great honor and pleasure to meet you all this morning. Well, this morning, we are going to talk about the alliance for the last 70 years, and perhaps the next 70 years. I remember being in Seoul for the Alliance 60th birthday. This is 70th birthday, so 60th birthday 10 years ago, celebrations. At that time, I attended a dialogue with ambassadors and had the honor to give a toast and brief remarks about that. Now, I'm delighted to be here 10 years later to celebrate our 70th anniversary with such wonderful friends. And it is meaningful that this event has come on the heels of the announcement, as Ambassador Stevens said, on the heels of the announcement of the upcoming state visit by President Yoon Suk-yeol, and that will be happening in late April. I look forward to sharing the wisdom of the ambassadors gathered here today to better prepare for the visit and for the future of our alliance. Well, in Korean tradition, turning 70 is something special. Turning 70 is a rare and special event. And what is true for a person, I think even more true for the alliance and relations between the states as well. The ROK-U.S alliance has endured and it is stood the test of time. As it turns 70, its longevity and also its resilience and the relevance should be celebrated as a collateral, a collective achievement of all us here. Our alliance is a testament to the strength of our partnership. It remains essential to peace and prosperity of the Korean Peninsula, Indo-Pacific and beyond. It upholds the international rules-based order and allows us to tackle global issues together, including global health, humanitarian crises, and climate change. Now, the ambassadors gathered here today are a living testament and the gathering of a collective wisdom to our shared commitment. So I would like to take a moment to highlight, there are so many, but highlight just some of their many contributions and achievements. Starting with Ambassador Hubbard. Ambassador Hubbard arrived in Korea one day before 9/11, 2001. Wow, what a day. And he picked the day, personally, I think. And just as the U.S. supported us Koreans during the Korean War, Korea supported the U.S. as allies should do. And Korea sent troops, doctors, and engineers and others to join the U.S.-led missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. Ambassador Hubbard was instrumental in making these decisions possible. To this day, Korea remains committed to respond to crises around the world, from Lebanon to Somalia. Well, Ambassador Hill, supposed to be here, so Ambassador Hill, in any case I'll say it. Ambassador Hill was the first American ambassador to visit the May the 18th National Cemetery in Gwangju, Korea. The sympathy and respect he showed during the visit left a lasting positive impression throughout the country. He helped show how deeply rooted the shared values of freedom and democracy are in our alliance. We will see the legacy of this commitment later this month when Korea hosts the second Democracy Summit, co-hosts the summit with the United States. Well, Ambassador Vershbow. During Ambassador Vershbow's tenure, really the very important event happened that is called the KORUS, Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. The negotiations were concluded, and this is truly a landmark event in our long, successful alliance. Since the FTA took effect, U.S. investment in Korea has doubled. The Korean investment to the United States has tripled. Without a doubt, it has been an outstanding success and brought great benefit to both our nations. Ambassador Stevens made it her mission to promote people-to-people exchange. As the first Korean-speaking American ambassador, she used her bicycle to travel extensively around the country and made a lot of friends and reach out to the local communities. It was during her tenure that Korea joined the U.S. visa waiver program. Well, of course, this has enabled more than 12 million Koreans to visit the United States without the hassle of getting the visa. This is very, very important, remarkable achievement, I believe. And finally, Ambassador Harris. Ambassador Harris had a challenging task of being ambassador when the COVID pandemic hit both countries. Yet, his positive messages and constant reiteration of the value of our partnership was a source of strength for many Koreans at a very difficult time. And I should also emphasize and mention how impressed I personally was by looking at a photo of the Ambassador Harris kneeling next to a General Baek Sun-hyuk, a true legend and Korean war hero. And that photo really made a very impactful impression on many of the people who value the alliance between our two countries. The Ambassador Harris clearly understood that without the sacrifices of veterans from both our countries, our alliance would not be what it is today. Well, it is my humble hope that I will be able to emulate some of the achievements I said about all these distinguished ambassadors, and perhaps make my contribution to make the Korea-U.S. alliance robust and resilient, and perhaps more modernized, looking at the next 70 years. So, our partnership has evolved over the last 70 years, and it has become an essential part of both of our foreign policies and national security policies. During that time, the range and scope of our cooperation have expanded, which I am sure we will be discussing in greater depth today. We still have many challenges. North Korea continues to advance its nuclear and missile capabilities. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has threatened the rules-based international order, and supply chain disruptions, climate change, and energy crises impact our lives on a daily basis. But how difficult these challenges are, I can share with you that our alliance is stronger and more comprehensive, more strategically focused, and more future-oriented these days. So we look forward to the next 70 years and beyond. I look forward to hearing the wisdom and thoughts of distinguished ambassadors here as we undertake the journey to the future together. 같이 갑시다. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. If you want to sit on the stage now, it's fine. Ambassador Cho, thank you so much for such gracious and generous and thoughtful words to start us off. We're now going to turn to the screens. We're all very used to doing this now, to hear from Ambassador Philip Goldberg, the current U.S. ambassador in Seoul, a career ambassador in the U.S. Foreign Service, and a great friend. So over to Ambassador Goldberg.
Good morning and greetings from Seoul. Thank you, Ambassador Stevens and Ambassador Cho, for organizing today's event and gathering so many of our distinguished colleagues. Here at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul, we're busy preparing for the 70th anniversary of the U.S. ROK Alliance. As we reflect on our shared history and friendship, I encourage us all to look forward and consider where the next 70 years will take us. While so much has changed over the past 7 decades, our commitment to one another as allies, partners, and friends has remained steadfast and will only grow in the years to come. Our alliance was founded on the core belief that the best way to protect ourselves is by helping others protect themselves. As allies, we built a global network of like-minded nations committed to maintaining peace and stability, market-based principles, and respect for international law, including freedom of navigation and overflight, and other lawful use of the air, sea, space, and cyberspace. Today, as we face unprecedented threats posed by authoritarian states, we're redefining and reinforcing our shared security with joint U.S. ROK initiatives that touch on every aspect of global security to include not only conventional defense, but also cybersecurity, crisis management and emergency response, humanitarian assistance, health security, climate change mitigation, and much more. We're truly allies in serving the greater good. Since 1953, peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula have been the centerpiece of our alliance, and it remains so. But the U.S. ROK alliance has brought us more than shared security. It's made us partners in prosperity and the closest of friends. What started as a military alliance has grown into a global economic partnership. Our countries are linked by trade, supply chains, and innovative technologies that continue to transform our world. As economic partners, we're trading with and investing in each other's countries. We're collaborating on critical and emerging technologies. Our leading tech companies are building digital platforms that bring us closer together as global partners. Last year, Korean and U.S. firms committed tens of billions of dollars to joint ventures and investments in areas critical to the global economy, like semiconductors, solar cells, and high-capacity batteries. This extensive bilateral trade and investment benefits both Koreans and Americans. Samsung is building its largest chip fab in Texas, and American company Coupang is the largest creator of new jobs in Korea. We're proud to partner with Korea because we know U.S. ROK economic engagement will continue to be marked by mutual trust, openness, transparency, and inclusiveness. South Korea is an essential partner in securing critical supply chains and partnering on other initiatives that advance our economic security, including the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, Mineral Security Partnership, and the East Asia Semiconductor Supply Chain Work Group, or Fab 4. Together, our countries have developed innovative technologies that have transformed our economies and improved the lives of citizens around the world. Our science and technology cooperation dates to the early days of our alliance. In 1965, our governments co-founded the Korea Institute of Science and Technology, which developed industrial technologies that fueled South Korea's economic transformation. Since then, the ROK has become a global leader, and its research institutes continue to develop innovative technologies that improve the lives of both our populations and help us address global threats such as climate change. Korea's clean energy technology is pivotal to the transition to a green economy in the United States, here in Korea, and throughout the world. I'm heartened to see historic investments in clean energy infrastructure. Joint ventures between our companies leverage our collective leadership in technological innovation, industrial scalability, and market access to make meaningful change and stem the devastating impact of climate change on our planet. Last month in Washington, Secretary Blinken and Minister Pak signed a renewed science and technology agreement to continue our work together on scientific advances that will serve the citizens of all countries. This agreement expands cooperation in areas that we've long worked together on, like space, but also in emerging fields like biotechnology, quantum, and artificial intelligence. In the coming decades, we'll need to work together to use these technologies in a way that serves our people, protects our interests, and upholds our democratic values. As economic partners, we want to give people outside our respective borders a chance to thrive because we know that the world is a safer place for all of us when others enjoy the same freedoms and opportunities that we do. That's why we've committed to deepen our bilateral cooperative relationship for development. Together, the U.S. Agency for International Development and ROK Ministry of Foreign Affairs collaborate on a range of initiatives worldwide, including combating climate change in the Pacific Islands, enhancing cybersecurity in Southeast Asia, and strengthening health systems in Africa. As Korea continues to emerge as a global leader, it becomes an increasingly essential partner in upholding democratic principles. From standing with Ukraine against Russia's unprovoked and brutal war of aggression to condemning human rights violations in North Korea, and holding the junta in Burma to account, the United States and the Republic of Korea work together to counter the malign influence of authoritarian regimes and stand up for those fighting for freedom around the world. The vision I've outlined of our alliance for the future is fairly staggering in both its depth and breadth. Fortunately, we've been working toward it for quite some time. Sure, we've been allies for 70 years, but We've been friends for twice that long. The U.S. ROK relationship goes back 140 years. And in all that time, Koreans and Americans have been building the vast network of ties that lies at the heart of the relationship we enjoy today in business and industry, civil society, between communities, and between families. These bonds are strong not solely because of the commitment between our governments. These bonds are strong because of our shared interests, shared passions, and our shared affinity. Our bonds will continue to grow with the next generation of leaders. Korean students are still the third largest population of foreign students in the United States. These exchanges of people between our countries ensure we will succeed together in the next 70 years as allies, partners, and friends. Good luck in the conference. Nice being with you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Goldberg, and thank you, Ambassador Cho, for setting the stage so well. I'm going to turn now to Ambassador Jo Yoon to kick us off. And we see Ambassador Chris Hill is joining us from Belgrade in Serbia, where he's serving as the U.S. Ambassador. So welcome, Ambassador Hill. Joe, over to you. I'm going to join you on the stage.
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks to our organizers, and really very good to be here. I think many of us don't appreciate how difficult this is to organize, to get this many ambassadors together, you know, and as you can see, you know, with Ambassador Hill joining us from Belgrade, and it's been very difficult. Really, congratulations, especially to KEI getting everyone together here. I'm not going to introduce them. I think Ambassador Cho has done an excellent job. But just to give a little bit of introduction to Ambassador Cho Tae-young, who has been really a counterpart to virtually all of you, you know, here. And so he looks young. He's not all that young, you know? Yeah. Thank you. You know? You know? So anyhow, welcome. So, you know, one of the most well-known Secretary of State was George Shultz, and he kind of compared diplomacy with gardening, and that you have to make sure a good gardener has to till the field, you know, plant when it's necessary, you know, manure, give it manure when it's necessary, and cut when it's necessary, all those things. So you're seeing here today what I would call constant gardeners of our alliance for the past at least 3 decades, you know? And so on that theme, on the alliance theme, I really do want to turn to Ambassador Hubbard initially. By the way, this is going to be a free-flowing conversation. They're all my bosses, okay? And it would be really presumptuous of me to say you have few minutes or this many minutes, or can you stop now, you know? So there's no rules, okay? It's going to be completely free-flowing because I cannot tell them what to do. So maybe Ambassador Hubbard, as you look back, I think you were ambassador there, as we say, about 20 years ago, you know, 25 years ago. And so you had this challenge. How do you look back compared to what you found there, the challenges you found there, and to today, okay?
Well, thank you very much, Joe, and thank all of you at KEI for putting on this rerun of our ambassadorial gathering. I think I was at the 60th anniversary 10 years ago. The 70th anniversary is certainly an occasion we want to celebrate, and it's really wonderful to be here with all of you and with many of my successors. I guess I'm speaking first because my time as ambassador probably dates back farther than that of any other person sitting here. But I also wanted to say I checked a bit, and I wanted to point out that I'm not the oldest living former U.S. ambassador to Korea. In fact, as Joe said, I started as ambassador to Korea now 22 years ago in 2001. But before me, we had three very distinguished ambassadors immediately preceding me. One was Jim Laney, a very solid Korea expert, former university president, now resident in Georgia, was very close to President Carter and became Bill Clinton's ambassador. I knew him well because I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in charge of Korea, among other things, during his time as ambassador. Jim is in his mid-90s somewhere, late 90s, was unable to attend but wishes us well. And also Don Gregg, who played a huge role in the U.S. Korea relationship through the years. Don is also in his mid-90s, was unable to join us today, but I wanted to mention that he is still with us and wishes us well. And then finally, my most immediate predecessor, Steve Bosworth, who also played a huge role on Korea, both South Korea and North Korea, died sadly a few years ago. But his spirit and his policies are very much still with us as we go forward. Thank you, Ambassador Cho, for mentioning the things you did as you began the session. A lot of people have thought I had a rather rough time as ambassador, but thinking it over through the years and as we produced this book we did, I rather than describing it as a hard time, I'd rather describe it as a time in which we sowed the seeds in many ways for the flourishing garden that this U.S. Korea relationship has become. We did have some difficult moments. We had George W. Bush, a Republican, as president in the United States, and we had Kim Dae-jung, a progressive, as president in Korea. President Kim, throughout his political life, had put a great premium on engaging North Korea and trying to bring about peace and unification on the peninsula. He had, I think, had a very close relationship with Bill Clinton, who was trying to do the same thing in North Korea with some help from me and others. And when President Bush came into office, many on his team had real doubts about the agreed framework, which was then the basis of outreach to North Korea. About the time I arrived in Seoul, it had become pretty clear that Bush was not going to move forward with the agreed framework. So we had definite issues in dealing with this primary problem we faced together, still is, North Korea. And one of the images that stays in my mind is axis of evil, trying to work through a situation where President Kim Dae-jung had asked us to try to resume dialogue with a face-saving gesture to North Korea, and it seemed the answer from George W. Bush was kind of a hell no. We're not going to deal with evil. And it took a long time working through my period until I believe towards the end of that period we'd gotten things back on track. We'd had a successful visit by Bush to Seoul, and finally, and I know Chris Hill and Sandy will talk more about it, we sort of got into the six-party talks towards the end of my time and got back on track. You also, Ambassador Cho, pointed out that actually I arrived, depending on the date, the date line, I arrived actually in Seoul immediately after the planes crashed into the World Trade Center in New York and to the Pentagon. And obviously my earliest days were were spent in trying to deal with that, both as an issue of counterterrorism, but also as an issue of real crisis for us. It affected all of our relationships around the world. Certainly in the case of Korea, it put new value on the alliance, a different value on the alliance, and thank you, Ambassador Cho, for mentioning the fact that I think the positive was that with a lot of work, Korea did join in, not only expressing sympathy to us, but doing concrete things to help the counterterrorism effort and eventually the war in Iraq. And that was a very positive benefit. It was clear. I think another benefit was that, this whole period of the terrorist threat in Iraq caused us to take a very hard look at how we should shape our military alliances around the world. And in fact, it caused Secretary Rumsfeld in the United States to say, hey, we really shouldn't have our military personnel right on the DMZ. We should have them in more protected places. We should have our training level areas in safer places, et cetera. And perhaps we don't need as many troops in Korea. So we had to work through a real reorganization of our military relationship that is still underway, and we still don't have the combined command, et cetera, that we're working towards. But it did, I think, one of the things that affected my situation in Korea was that we had probably the worst accident we have ever had in the history of this relationship, when two young teenagers were run over by U.S. heavy vehicles near a training area that was off-site. It was an awful, terrible, tragic accident. I'm not sure we in the United States quite handled it the way we should have. Clearly, it really affected the alliance and the relationship, caused massive demonstrations, anti-American demonstrations, and so on, as well as a re-examination of the relationship. And that kind of brings me to another important point I would like to make is that, the aftermath of that terrible accident, a new Korean president was elected, Roh Moo-hyun. Everybody Kim Dae-jung was very much reaching out to North Korea, but he was also very solid on the U.S. alliance and the existing deterrence. Many wondered whether Roh Moo-hyun would follow in that footsteps. He had been anti-base as a youth. He'd never been to the United States, et cetera. And in fact, Roh Moo-hyun became, I think, a very effective and close partner with us in trying to build that new relationship that we were working on. I shortly after he was elected, I had an opportunity to meet with him because I was coming back to the United States, and I said, "Congratulations, Mr. President-elect. We understand what's going on here. We see what's happening publicly, and I want you to know that we want to work with you to build a new kind of relationship that will support both of our interests." And he said, without blinking an eye, "I see no need for significant changes in the alliance." And I think that set a new standard for the alliance, whereas I think subsequently popular support has gone up. There's been much less base activity, much broader acceptance of the alliance. And I think President Roh, coming from where he did in the political spectrum, played a very large role in preserving the alliance and establishing a firmer basis, and that too has continued through the years. And then finally, I just this is not all I would say afterwards, but I think another thing that President Roh Moo-hyun did, with some help from us, is put the economic relationship on a firmer basis. When I arrived in Korea, the thought of having a free trade agreement between the U.S. and Korea was just impossible. The biggest issue we faced was the Korean screen quota, which now seems like a quaint relic given what's happened, but maybe we ought to confess that it works. The Korean movie industry is gone. But we got over that, and we got in to begin the process of seeking a free trade agreement, and that again has been very important. So I'll stop here, and perhaps...
Well, thank you very much. I think sowing the seeds, that's a great metaphor for Ambassador Hubbard's tenure, and bring back a lot of good memories and bad memories, of those days. Since you started with North Korea, and since the alliance is mostly about North Korea, I wanted to turn to Ambassador Hill in very far away in Belgrade and ask him, because we associate him so much with six-party talks, successes there, and a little bit of disappointment towards the end, of course. How he saw that, and what is its relevance, your experience, how would you advise current crop of North Korean handlers in Washington?
Well, thank you very much, Joe. And let me say, I'm just so pleased to be involved in this great conference. Let me just say, it seems like a long time ago, but going to Korea was really one of the highlights of my career. To be sure, it was just a fabulous country to be in. I mean, just a very special relationship we've had with Korea. And I think what's really special is some of what you've done today, which is to bring different ambassadors from different times together. Because when you work on Korea, you're always building on what someone else did. I mean, you stand on the shoulders of your predecessors. Tom Hubbard certainly started a lot of things that I worked on, and I like to think that others who followed me, Sandy Birchbow, Kathy Stevens, also took some things that I did and continued to work them. So it's really one of those places that I think has a very special resonance for any career person in the Foreign Service, a special resonance to the kind of continuity of foreign policy. With respect to North Korea, when I started working on Korea, I realized it had become a kind of a major problem because we had a tone coming out of Washington that was much more severe than our Korean friends really wanted to hear. We seemed to be completely out of sync. It's easy to talk when you're several thousand miles away to talk about the problems of North Korea without kind of noticing that for people in Seoul, they can practically see North Korea from their bedroom. I find Sarah Palin and quite an inspiration for that expression. It was absolutely true. People were very close, in close proximity to North Korea, and we needed to be a little careful about how we spoke about it, and especially talking about outbreak of war and issues like that. So I think a big issue for me was to try to synchronize our policies with Korea and to try to work together. And I feel the six-party talks was a real example of this, because I don't think I had a partner as close as I did the ROK. Ambassador Cho, great to hear your voice, because you've also done your time in the six-party talks. And I had many other friends and colleagues on the Korean side who worked very hard and worked very closely with us, such that at the end of the day, I think any problems that we were having with South Korea were actually rather well addressed as we worked together as sort of band of brothers, and not big brother and little brother, to take that awful expression I remember hearing from time to time, but rather two equals in a very difficult process. So I think we made some progress. We were able to get get North Korea to stop producing nuclear material. No question there were some setbacks. And as Ambassador Yoon noted, when we got to the end of the of my tenure, working on North Korea, we dealt with the disappointment of that we were unable to go ahead with the process. And frankly, I don't think it's in a better place today. I'm not going to comment on ongoing policy. I've got my hands full out here in Belgrade, Serbia. There's always unfinished business in the foreign policy and the foreign service. So I come back to Belgrade, Serbia, and I hear the word Kosovo that I thought I had left behind some 23 years ago. So I'm not going to give too much advice to the current crop of diplomats working on this, except to say that I think insofar as we can stay close to our South Korean friends on this, insofar as we can respect their views, as they certainly respect our views, and insofar as we can kind of look for common approaches and be respectful of where the ROK, where it's located, as opposed to thousands and thousands miles away in Washington, I think we can make some progress. I will say that, to be sure, Ukraine is an enormous issue, but as Ambassador Goldberg pointed out, we do a lot of work with the ROK on Ukraine as well. So I think it kind of speaks to the fact that over the years, our relationship with ROK, which often was about peninsula affairs and to some extent regional affairs, is now really about global affairs, and we deal with the ROK across the board around the world. And I think it's very, very inspiring to have that. I work here in Belgrade with a Korean ambassador quite often, and we talk about all kinds of things of mutual interest that not about North Korea, but other things as well. So I think there's much that we've grown together as partners and allies. I think the strategic alliance is very strong, and I think it's I give credit to everybody who's worked on it. It hasn't been easy at times, but when I think back to some of the people who were working in the embassy when I was there, Yuri Kim, now ambassador in one of the countries here in the Balkans, Eric John, who went on to be an ambassador, Mark Minton, who went on to be ambassador. It was kind of really speaks well, and of course Sung Kim, who went on to be an ambassador. So it really speaks well of who the Foreign Service sends to Korea. And in Ambassador Goldberg, who I first met back in 1994 when we were together working on the Balkans, it's another sign that I think we do try to send our really very best. So it's great to hear Phil's voice and to hear where we are today in this relationship. So Joe, I think I'll stop there, and maybe happy to pick up when we get to a more interactive format.
Sure. Thank you very much. Please stay on. And I want to go to Ambassador Vershbow, and rather than looking back, I want him to look forward. One issue that Chris raised was that we have to kind of be in sync with South Korean allies. And most recently, there was a survey showing that some 75% of South Koreans wanted South Korean nuclear weapons. And so to me, this is also was a campaign issue for President Yoon, and he's going to be in town quite soon. So I wanted to, in Sandy Vershbow, we have American foremost expert on arms control issues, nuclear issues, and also dealing with NATO, where we do have nuclear sharing, all those issues. So can you tell us, based on your experience and looking forward, how the alliance should deal with this particular issue?
Well, thanks, Joe, for turning us more towards the present and the future. I just want to say, though, at the outset, I very much appreciate the invitation to participate in this event and to celebrate the 70th anniversary and to begin to prepare ourselves for the next 70 years. It was certainly a fascinating assignment for me, my first and only assignment in Asia, but with a lot of issues that were familiar from my time working on NATO issues, nuclear issues, Russia policy. I like to say I was sent to Korea because it was the last front in the Cold War. So it looks like Russia is competing for that title these days. But it was, I think, a very productive time. Well, it didn't start on such an optimistic note. We had a very optimistic development just before I arrived, which was Chris Hill's success in working within the six-party framework to negotiate the September 2005 joint statement. But maybe it was a coincidence, maybe it was all because of me. As soon as I arrived, we kind of descended into mutual recriminations because President Roh Moo-hyun couldn't understand why, after the breakthrough in the six-party talks, we got so exercised over counterfeiting and other criminal activities by the North Korean regime. Anyway, we got past that, and we did do a lot during my 3 years from 2005 to 2008 in further developing the alliance, moving it more and more from a regional to a global alliance. We did, of course, negotiate the KORUS FTA during that time, which I worked very closely on. It was new terrain for me. That was one issue I hadn't worked on in my career. And I was disappointed after I left that President Obama chose to renegotiate it, and we lost several precious years. We lost our first mover advantage, but it's still delivering tremendous benefits to both countries. And I think it set the standard for trade policy and trade agreements going forward. And of course, dealing with the changing strategic environment, I think the ROK-U.S. alliance has shown its adaptability, which is something I think is very important for any alliance. Certainly I used to work on NATO adaptation, and I think the adaptation of our mutual defense treaty is a great mutual success story for both sides. But you asked about the significance and how do we respond to the growing sentiment in South Korea in favor of either the return of U.S. nuclear weapons to the peninsula, or more controversially, for South Korea to develop its own nuclear weapons capability. I think that would be an overreaction to the situation we're in right now. I mean, yes, North Korea is now definitely a heavily armed nuclear weapons state de facto, even if we don't want to recognize them de jure. And we need to think about how to manage what will be a continuing threat for many years to come. Don't give up on denuclearization as a long-term goal, but don't count on achieving it, probably in my lifetime and maybe in other people's lifetime. But I think that for Korea to develop its own nuclear weapons would just provoke a further development of nuclear weapons and missile delivery systems by North Korea, but also would start a chain reaction of proliferation, potentially including friendly nations like Japan, but also setting a precedent for other countries in different parts of the world. And I think that's a Pandora's box that we don't want to open. But we do need to, I think, address the genuine concerns about the credibility of the U.S. nuclear guarantee, which the polls reflect. And I think work has already started, and I think this should be given even higher priority, which is to develop a new framework for U.S. and U.S. extended deterrence, the nuclear guarantee that we provide for South Korea. And this could be done in tandem with Japan, which also has its own anxieties about the U.S. extended deterrent guarantee. We could develop institutions similar to what we have in NATO, a nuclear planning group, which could not only look at strategy and exercises, but could even be a way of signaling to North Korea that their provocative behavior is backfiring and induce them to get more serious about arms control, if not about denuclearization in the fullest sense of the term. So extended deterrence, I think, should be the focus. I think that's something that is likely to be on the agenda for the state visit by President Yoon in April. And I hope some significant steps forward towards institutionalizing nuclear planning, nuclear cooperation, but not necessarily reintroducing nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula, which, as I said at the beginning, could be counterproductive.
Thank you very much for this very, very helpful comments on extended deterrence and strengthening, essentially, extended deterrence. But I guess you don't want to go and, trigger proliferation just yet. Okay, yeah.
Listen, there's enough headaches in the world. More nuclear proliferation, I think, is something we don't need.
Okay, and I'm going to come back to see Ambassador Cho's reaction to these discussions a little bit later. But I wanted to ask Ambassador Stevens, we've seen the transitions, of course, Tom Hubbard witnessed them, going on from Clinton to Bush, and before that, from in Korea, Kim Dae-jung to Roh Moo-hyun, and you witnessed number of these transitions, both in Korea and in the U.S. I remember working under you when we had the transition from Bush to Obama, right? So as you see these changes in the Blue House or the White House, how, as ambassador, did you deal with them?
Yeah, well, thank you, Joe. This has brought back lots of memories flooding back, so I'll try not to waller too much in them all. But I did arrive in Seoul as ambassador in September of 2008. So here in the United States, there was an election season going on, Obama versus McCain, and I had been nominated by President George W. Bush as a career officer and had what seemed then, of course, to me personally, like an endless confirmation process. Now it seems really short compared to what's going on now. But I arrived in September, and I was certainly aware we had, and the Koreans were, there was an election coming up. And there were several big issues that were on my mind. One, the day I arrived, well, not quite as dramatic as what Ambassador Hubbard faced arriving there, in the aftermath of 9/11. But I remember getting off the plane in Seoul, and I heard on the news that Lehman Brothers had just collapsed. The global crisis, the financial crisis, was on us. And then getting to that gardening metaphor, you're never sure what's going to turn out to be really toxic, right? And I thought, wow, am I going to be dealing as Ambassador Bosworth did? When he arrived literally on the eve of the Asian financial crisis with, the implications of that for the relationship and for both Korea and our economies. So I did try to pay a lot of attention, if you like, to that issue right away. And I think I was helped by the fact that with the support of the Bush administration, South Korea had recently joined the G20, the new grouping of 20 industrialized countries, a little broader and more representative than the G7 or the G8. And was active in that. And in fact, then President Obama, after he was elected, had his first meeting, I believe, if I recall right, with President Lee Myung-bak in London at a G20 conference and then summit. And then, of course, South Korea went on to host a G20 summit. Not all about having meetings, but South Korea was at the top table, I think, with the support of the United States. A lot of lessons had been learned, most importantly in Korea itself, from the Asian financial crisis. And it kind of turned out to be certainly a serious issue, but one where, first of all, from the point of view of the United States, we were seen rightly as doing things about it, and working together about it, and finding a way forward. So that was certainly on my mind. But of course, we had our election coming up, and this seems, again, a little quaint now when I look back, but embassies around the world, and I did this in Seoul, used to host, well, maybe we still do, election parties. Yeah. So I elected, and of course with the time difference, it was election breakfast at the residence. And we had figures of Obama and McCain. You could pose with either one, and ballots, paper ballots, by the way, no machines. People voted. And it was a celebration of democracy. And certainly as an ambassador, you serve across administrations, you hope. But ambassadors, when a new administration comes in, regardless, know they serve at the pleasure of the president. And fortunately, I served more than 3 months, and I stayed on. So, of course, most of my tenure was under President Obama. But I think from the point of view of what we do, and others here could speak to that too, is we try to see where we can, where there is continuity in policy, but also where there is not, to try to bridge those things and manage them in a way that's going to keep us, moving in a positive direction in the alliance and in the relationship. So 2 examples, I would say, from that time in terms of the transition. One is on North Korea policy, and I actually think that on North Korea policy, the George W. Bush to Obama transition was a good example of, in this case, the Obama administration learning a lesson from previous administrations and thinking, okay, things are not going great, but we've got to keep at this. So through that transition period, that 2 months we have, and into the new year, there was a sense that we're going to keep going forward. And of course, Ambassador Hill remembers this well, because I remember in one of my first weeks at the residence, he showed up along with some other people he mentioned, and they were taking a car to Pyongyang, very unusual at the time, still trying to keep things going with North Korea, with the support and cooperation between the Bush team and the Obama team. That, from a point of view of trying to do diplomacy, even if in the end you're disappointed, I think was a positive thing and a lesson learned from the past. What was more challenging, and Sandy alluded to it, was that candidate Obama had campaigned on a promise of looking critically at the free trade agreements that had been agreed. So we had a free trade agreement that had been signed by the Nomi Hun administration and the George W. Bush administration. Now we had a new administration, if you like, Lee Myung-bak coming in earlier in Seoul, and Obama in Washington. And of course in Seoul, earlier in the year, as Sandy will well remember, there were very large demonstrations. At least, ostensibly on the issue of the safety of American beef, but it went to a lot of anxieties about the economic relationship, about the role of the United States. So the mood in Korea, I would say, and for the Lee Myung-bak government was challenging. And we had an American president, but wanted to go forward with the free trade agreement. We had an American president who was saying, no, we need to renegotiate. We never said that in Seoul. Adjust, discuss further. And indeed, that did take about 3 years. And in the meantime, the EU got in there and negotiated their own agreement.
Even Canada.
Yes, and even Canada. But we got there in the end. So that's, what those transitions are about. And I know I hear still in Washington a lot of people sort of say, gosh, we'll just never get anything together because every time we think we're going to do something, there's an election. And of course, we have our midterms, too, which also have a big impact on a lot of our foreign policy. But, it's sort of like the Churchill quote about democracy. Given the alternatives, I'd rather have the elections. And I do think that one of the things that's underappreciated about the U.S. South Korea relationship is, over time, it has enjoyed increasing, I would say, bipartisan support in both countries. And of course, I understand that in politics and campaigns, the differences are sometimes, I would say, exaggerated, but emphasized. But there is a deep bipartisan support in both countries, and I think that's part of the achievement of the last 70 years.
Thank you very much. I think I realized only recently how hard it is to do FTAs. Korea is the last one U.S. has done. We have not done one since, and of course, U.S. has pulled out of TPP because it was just too hard. And so we thought it was very hard on Korea. Well, it's kind of equally hard on the United States, which is why after the signing, it took several years, as Sandy mentioned, for us to ratify it,
Actually, Joe, if I could just add one more kind of example. At that time, Ambassador Han Duck-soo, now Prime Minister, I said Prime Minister Han Duck-soo was Korean ambassador in Washington, and he and I, on a KEI program, traveled around the U.S. To Montana, Utah, Nevada, I remember all this, Texas, and at that time, our two governments' positions on the FTA were not the same. As I was representing the Obama administration, it was, this has some issues, we need to work on it. And of course, the Korean government positions, we want to go forward with this. Mm-hmm. So, we had to be, careful. I don't want to say diplomatic, but we had to, talk about our issues, but make clear that there was some distance between us. Right. And we could do that, which I think is another sign of a kind of a mature sort of relationship, that, I did get a few worried calls from Washington sometimes, what are you saying to Montana Public Radio about the FTA? But, that's part of the job too. But we managed.
Well, thank you. And the other hard issue is, of course, the very difficult neighbors South Korea has, Japan just recently announced a kind of an emerging agreement on enforced labor issues. And then China, of course. And so I think the person kind of who experienced all that full frontally is Ambassador Harris, and he's been doing that long time. I mean, you remember that he was the PACOM commander, probably among the most important combatant commanders of the United States. He after doing that, he came to Korea. So, Ambassador Harris, can we turn over to you, see your experience, your dealing with the regional issues as well as other issues, obviously.
Thanks, Joe. I want to be forward-looking in my response to your question. But let me begin by saying that I'm honored to be here on the panel. Thanks to KEI and the Korean Embassy for putting this together. This is really an important time. I want to add on to something that Ambassador Hill said, which is that America does send our best and brightest diplomats to Korea at all levels. But I'm the exception that proves the rule. I was at best Plan B, and I may have been Plan C or D, not really sure. But that's the reason that I'm honored to be here with all of you, because I learned from all of you. So you all carried me, and thank you for that. Ambassador Cho, thanks for your kind comments as well on COVID and all the rest, but I want to acknowledge that it was Rob Rabson who actually put together the COVID policy and executed it for the United States in Korea. So thank you, Rob, for that. I just followed that like I always do. But I do believe this is a grand time in U.S.-Korean relations. We have a lot of folks to thank for that, but certainly Ambassador Cho and Ambassador Goldberg in Korea. So I've got a broad topic, really, to talk about China, Japan, and et cetera. That et cetera could take hours, but I'm only going to talk really about China and maybe a little about Japan and Taiwan if we have time. Let me just begin by saying that there are a lot of global issues that are affecting the United States today. You have Russia, Ukraine, you've got North Korea, of course, you've got some residual counterterrorism issues around the world, but these are really operational issues. To use the garden analogy that we all seem to be captured by, these are weeds in the garden. We have to take care of them. We have to deal with them, but they're operational issues. The PRC, or China, on the other hand, is not an operational issue. It's a strategic challenge to the United States and indeed the world. We have a new national security strategy that came out last year, and it recognizes that China is the only country in the world with the intent and increasingly the capability to affect and change the global international order. So to use this garden analogy to its bitter end, China could be a flamethrower in that garden. And we have to acknowledge the danger that the PRC presents, not only to the United States, but to the free world writ large. So I've been a critic of the PRC for a long, long time, certainly through my time in Korea, but well before that in my time in the Navy. I think that its conduct on the global stage is indicative of the kind of country that China is, and is indicative of the kind of partner that China is if you choose to partner with China. And we, the United States, we've had success in dealing with, in partnering with China on a number of important fronts. But we fundamentally disagree with the PRC on the direction for the world. You don't have to believe me, you can believe the Secretary of State who testified that what China is doing to its own people in Muslim Western China is genocide. That is a strong word, especially in diplomacy, but that's what Secretary Blinken called it. That he said that democracy is being trampled in Hong Kong, and that the previous administration's approach to China is right. And Secretary Austin, the Secretary of Defense, he testified that China is the pacing threat, and he promised strong support for Taiwan. It just looked recently, just earlier this week, the president of China actually threatened the United States, Xi Jinping, and his foreign minister, wolf warrior type that he is, echoed that sentiment just day before yesterday in threatening the United States. You need look no further past than a few weeks ago, last month really, on this crazy balloon drama that played out. That in this balloon drama, China actually said repeatedly that the balloon was inadvertent and innocuous. That actually beggars the imagination if you think about it. It took us 8 days to track that balloon across the continent in the United States, which is to say there were 8 days of opportunity for diplomacy by China, by Beijing, to play out. And typical, no surprise, they refused. They doubled down on their position that the balloon was somehow innocuous and accidental. So that's typical of the PRC's bad behavior. Look at the South China Sea and all the activities, illegal activities per the United Nations that the PRC has executed in the South China Sea. And you see the type of partner that the PRC is. So I'll stop there on the PRC. I'll talk about Taiwan just briefly. I was in Taiwan last month and had the chance to meet with the Taiwan leadership and tour some of their industries and defense industries particularly. And I'm a believer that our policy, our American policy of strategic ambiguity has come to an end, that we need to adopt a new policy of strategic clarity when it comes to Taiwan. President Biden himself has said that we would defend Taiwan in case of a forcible attack by China to reunify. He has said that 4 times. It has been walked back 4 times by people that are unelected in the administration. But I believe that the president has been clear, and his declaration will set the stage and will be hard to walk back by other future presidents of the United States downrange. So Taiwan is a innovation nation, a global force for good, and we ought to give more support to Taiwan, in my opinion. I'll talk about Japan just briefly. This is, in my view, the example of statesmanship. Statesmanship by President Yoon and statesmanship by Prime Minister Kishida. And so we have this difficult issue. And by no means am I trying to lessen the importance and the seriousness of the historical issues that are resident between Japan and South Korea. But because of the statesmanship by these 2 leaders, both countries can look to the future. We should never downplay our the honor which we hold our ancestors, but we should also look to the future to set the stage for success by our descendants. And that is what I believe President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida have done. And now we'll see if there are fruits to their labors, if there are indeed seeds that are going to germinate into a great flower in that relationship. So I think I heard just last night that Prime Minister Kishida has invited President Yoon to Japan on the 16th of this month, which is not insignificant. And then we'll see where that goes. So I'm excited about that. This is a great time, I think, in the Japan-South Korea relationship, in the U.S. South Korea-Japan trilateral relationship, and certainly in the U.S. Korea alliance. So I'll stop there and just respond to any other questions anyone might have.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Harris. I think many of us would really agree with your comment that the leaders of Japan and South Korea were very, very courageous in reaching this agreement and really touch wood. I have a lot of wood here, you know, that it does work out. I would like to now, I mean, by the way, you know, anyone's free to talk, obviously, but first reach out to Ambassador Cho. We've talked many things, alliance, North Korea, trade, regional issues, and covered a lot of ground, whether he has some comments to make.
Well, I learned a lot, and truly it's a pleasure to be here and listen to the distinguished ambassadors, their perspectives and their experiences and their sense of humor. So it's a wonderful thing to do. Well, there are so many things we can talk about the alliance these days. Let me say maybe 2 or 3. One is that this is my second tour in Washington, D.C. My first tour was 25 years ago. Quarter of a century ago, I was first secretary, and we talked about North Korea, and we talked about the alliance management, national security issues, very important for us, and that was it. Coming back after 25 years, I found there are more important subjects between our two countries and more entertaining subjects between our two countries. So national security, North Korean challenge, still very, very important, and two countries are talking about ways to strengthen the effectiveness of the extended deterrence mostly, to deal with a North Korean nuclear threat, and to maintain and strengthen our nuclear deterrence. So the conversation has been underway for some time. I hope that a productive outcome can come out of this conversation, and I hope that the Korea's voices be more institutionalized in the process of the working of the extended deterrence, and that I think is very important. Will send a very strong, robust, and important message to North Korean leadership, not to touch the nuclear button, and also send a very strong, robust, and positive, reassuring message to the Korean people facing this increasingly serious threat from North Korea. So what I'm saying is that the threat, yes, has increased. I was involved in 6-party talks, and we didn't get what we had sought after, but at the same time, the alliance response to the threat has also become very robust, and I think it's very important, and it is what the alliance is all about. The second thing is that now when we have meetings with Americans, the administrations, in the business community, or the think tank community, sometimes I don't even touch the issue of North Korea. But every time I should talk about the issues, kind of not my strong forte, that is economic security. So semiconductors, batteries, resilient supply chains, and Inflation Reduction Act, yes. Electric vehicles and tax credits, and the NOFO and proposed guidance. I mean, all these new issues that I have to learn and talk about it, because this is, I think, the exciting new center of the relationship. And Korea, which has traveled a long way from a small and economy into a important part of the supply chains, can really have a great deal to contribute. And we can build a very prosperous and again exciting and future stories. We can write the future stories together between ROK and the United States, and this is wonderful. 25 years ago, only one Korean big company had maintained an office in Washington, D.C. Now, every Korean companies, all of them are maintaining offices and important offices in Washington, D.C. And that's worthwhile because, as you know, the concept of industrial policy was not really there in Washington, D.C. for quite a while. But now, the United States government is pursuing a very proactive industrial policy with its support for the business sector, the subsidies, and also restrictions. So all of us, all of these things are important and matter to Korean big businesses. And while we have challenges in this area, of course, but mostly I think we are looking at a very different future that really can anchor the alliance in the next 7 decades. And finally, about the new thing in the alliance is that 25 years ago, nobody talked about Korean culture. We used to have a couple of Korean restaurants, but mostly frequented by Korean clientele. Coming back, gosh, I mean, there are so many things Korean films, Korean TV dramas, Korean songs, so BTS Army. I met one member of BTS Army who was like in her 50s and kind of very important and successful in her own career and important connections in Washington as well. But she was, she knew the names of all 7 members, and she knew exactly when these 7 members will go into military service. And so, what a change! I mean, what a change. But I think this is important because this cultural, the interaction really can bring our two peoples closer and together. And this one aspect of culture can spread to other aspects of culture. That's what I found. You know, if there are some American citizens who fall in love with certain Korean TV sitcoms or dramas, then they naturally are getting very interested in experiment with other parts of Korean culture, including Korean cuisine and other things. And some of them decide to travel to Korea, take a look at the country for themselves. So this, the government doesn't have an important role to play, but it just rolls and just moves forward in itself and by themselves. And this is very, very important, new, exciting areas of interaction between our two countries. About maybe 2 more things. About the extended deterrence, Joe said he's going to ask about my opinion. So I talked about extended deterrence, and I said that what is happening. I just want to add that going nuclear and reintroduction of American nuclear weapons are not the policies of President Yoon Suk-yeol. I can say that. So for sure, I recognize there are uneasiness and demands for more action from the Korean people. And this is, I think, in a way natural, facing a material threat just going up and facing one of the most aggressive nuclear doctrines announced by North Korea. So naturally, our people are concerned, and our people demand more actions and more assurances. That's exactly the two governments are trying to achieve, but that doesn't mean that Korean government's policy and its position on NPT has changed. So I can say that loud and clear here. And finally, Japan. Then come back to Harris. You took the words out of my mouth, actually, because I'm no Japan expert, but I know about Korea-Japan relations enough to know that the approaching these issues from the myopic political perspective, I think the best way is that just don't touch it. Once the American Secretary of State Warren Christopher said, that North Korea is a problem only with lousy options. But I can say the same thing about Japan from a political perspective. So Japan Korea-Japan relations is a political problem, lousy political problem, with only lousy political options. But I think my president and the Yoon Suk-yeol government are going beyond that, really lifting themselves up and try to decide to approach this issue not from a political point of view, but from a strategic point of view, from a larger, future-oriented point of view. And rather than going into back and forth negotiations, I think Korean government and President Yoon Suk-yeol decided to take the initiative and take the leadership and just do things that are ultimately, I believe, in the interests of my country. Yes, there are challenges, there are other voices, but if we'll be able to get across the message that it's not because of Japan, it's not because of other countries, or because of the future, a fundamental interest of ROK, to do this, to decisively make a decision to move forward in our relation with Japan. If we can get across this message correctly and effectively, I think the Yoon Suk-yeol decision this time will carry the day. And I think it's very important. This is I have to be really careful here, but I think it's very important to no longer being bound by an approach, looking at Japan, approaching Japan issue from a past history or from the sense of victimhood, but rather try to approach Japan as it is and in the future, and try to identify what are the core interests of the Republic of Korea in its approach to Japan. And I think President Yoon Suk-yeol made that decision. And I think it has to be appreciated and recognized that way. So I agree with Ambassador Harris that this is not a decision by a politician. This is a decision by a statesmanship. And both leaders, I think, have a lot more work to do. But I know that both leaders, Korea and Japan, are determined to make something positive out of this. So I'm very happy, and I think it's the right decision to make. And also, I have to add that this decision is not just about Korea and Japan, of course. This is about our relations with the United States. Our hope that we're going to maintain the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific and globally. And this will open up a lot of opportunities for two countries and also three countries, including the United States, to really work together and make something positive happen in the years to come. So I think it's a very important decision, and I'm very glad that this decision has been recognized as such in the important people, by the important people in Washington, D.C. So maybe I should stop.
Yeah, thank you very much for those very, very valuable comments. And really, I think we feel quite up to date with those comments. I wanted to, we don't have that much time left for all our former ambassadors here. Ask a question, on kind of how Korean public, American public sees the alliance or the relationship in general. Americans look mean and tough, but they're very sensitive, and for them, what the approval rating matters a lot. So they will. I remember working for them. They are consumed by are we up or down, and so I wanted to start again with Ambassador Hubbard, and what was some of the best moments and worst moments in what the Koreans think about the U.S.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think I already addressed part of that,
You
but
did, yeah.
but I think really the worst moment for my time was the aftermath of the death of the two young girls. It really was a terrible tragedy. It was the biggest accident I think as I said, we've had in the relationship. And it was very hard to convince the Korean public of our sincere regret and our sincere apology. Tammy Overby was there heading the AmCham during that time. And it was, I had the terrible moment when the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee was en route to Korea, was in Japan, and called me and said, I'm not coming. I won't go anywhere where you have all of these people out on the square where there's so much anti-Americanism. And so, that kind of was about as far down as you can go. And I think we've steadily come up, and I was really struck by what I think Kathy said, that I can't think of any relationship I've dealt with where public favorability in both countries has risen to the extent it has between Korea and the U.S. It's nonpartisan, as I mentioned. We've been able to, with Korea, we've been able to work with progressives, conservatives. I think we all worked it through. I thought perhaps, Kathy, after we got over the free trade stuff, perhaps the warmest relationship between two presidents was that between Barack Obama and Lee Myung-bak, coming from very different places. But certainly Obama profoundly respected Korea and what it had accomplished, and that showed. And I think Lee Myung-bak certainly showed his support for the relationship as we've gone through. So I guess that's enough.
Can we go to Chris Sale in Belgrade?
Can't hear you, Chris.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Sure, Joe, I'd be happy to contribute, but I'm not sure I was there long enough to have any really bad moments. I think frankly, there are always bad moments provided by our SecDef Rumsfeld, who suggested that we're having troops in Korea for the purpose of third country operations. And I guess the reason that was bad was when you're an ambassador, you want to be in a position that you're really reflecting views in Washington. Otherwise, you're just kind of an NGO or something. So I had to make sure that what I was saying was, in fact, the sort of, the prevailing thought in Washington. I had a lot of support, actually, from Condoleezza Rice in that regard. So I think we did very well. I like to think one of the major things we did was to work on our approach to North Korea as we got ready for the six-party talks. Obviously, I tried to work on the trilat process, the three baseball-playing countries, and I was kind of disappointed we didn't get very far on that. I ended up mediating, which is something I didn't want to do. So I think that had its challenges, as you discussed in the previous discussion. But I really think that we set out, I say we because I had, I had Kathy Stevens who came in behind me in the bureau when I was back in the bureau. So we had a real approach to South Korea, and it was all based on the idea that we're going to work together, and we're not going to surprise each other, and we're going to take into account each other's views and make sure that we don't have different perspectives. Again, sometimes you'd get some, there was a term called neoconservative. I don't know if any of you remember what it was, but occasionally, you'd get these kinds of comments out of left field. But fortunately, we had a president who backed us up. We had a Secretary of State who backed us up. And I think by and large, we did, I was very pleased with what we were able to do with the relationship at the time. understanding that I was standing on the shoulders of others, and others would subsequently stand on my shoulders. But I think it was a pretty seamless effort by the U.S. government.
I think your visit to Gwangju was a terrific thing for everyone, you know, both Americans and Koreans. I wanted to turn to Ambassador Verschbau.
Joe, could I keep forgetting to mention Gwangju, but before I went out as ambassador, I was sort of looking for a gesture that would be noticed. And I talked to a lot of Koreans about it. And there were old friends of mine from the 80s, a person named Son Myung-hyun, who's a great friend of mine. He passed away just recently. And Son Myung-hyun, his advice was, great idea, but be very careful that if it's announced ahead of time, you don't want a situation where you have pro-American NGOs lining up against anti-American NGOs and it becomes a circus. So he convinced me to keep it very quiet. I went off to the Gwangju Biennial, I guess it was called, and I looked at a lot of this three-dimensional art they had, and then I snuck off by myself and put some flowers on the grave there, and I think it worked out very well, probably better than I thought. And the most important point about it was the only press plan I had was no press plan. I didn't want any situation that it looked staged.
Thank you. Ambassador Verschbau?
Yeah, the challenge of managing and dealing with Korean public opinion was something that we've all grappled with in our time, and I think I still had to deal with some of the suspicions and the hostility that came out of the tragic accident with the two schoolgirls. And it was part of the maturation of our alliance. I think as those issues became much more easy to deal with. But perhaps the biggest explosion of public opinion that I had to deal with, which was near the end of my tour, and relating to the opening up of the beef market. Here's where I think Lee Myung-bak was very courageous. He got the message from us as he came into office that there was no chance of getting the FTA ratified, and we were trying to get it ratified during the final months of the Bush administration. That there was no chance of that happening unless Korea found a way, in accordance with science, not just as a purely political act, but a scientifically based decision to reopen the beef market. And we worked very hard on that. But this was an early example of something which we deal with now in many other contexts, the power of disinformation or fake news. There was indeed a documentary on one of the Korean TV channels, I think it was NBC.
Is it one of those guys?
Yeah. So all the perpetrators are retired now, I'm sure. But it was taking a case from the U.S., a supposed case of mad cow disease that in fact wasn't mad cow disease. It was a different disease with a similar name. But this kind of the story caught on like wildfire in social media, led to the candlelight vigils in and around Seoul, and ultimately to kind of riots and chaos in the streets for several weeks. And only after the record was set straight that this supposed incident of mad cow disease was nothing of the kind. But the damage was done. It had led to this, even very well-informed people asking me, why are you trying to kill us by importing this tainted beef? So I think it cost Lee Myung-bak some of his political support going forward. But I think it was a lesson in how you have to get ahead of the curve when it comes to disinformation, and rebut facts with facts, or rebut lies with facts, and over time it can work. And in fact, we got the beef market open before the end of the Bush administration, but we lost the FTA. And it was only through the renegotiation process that the agreement finally did enter into force. And as I said before, it was I think a missed opportunity, but an object lesson in the perils of how you deal with public opinion. I remember one of the most painful incidents was when I was misquoted as having supposedly told journalists outside of MOFA that Koreans need to learn more about the science of American beef, and this got translated as Koreans need to learn more science. and a country with highest per capita population of PhDs, this was seen as an insult. We managed to fix it fast, got the record straight on the U.S. Embassy website, but things can be seriously twisted in translation. That was another lesson.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that. Looking back on it, it's funny, but when you were there, it's not funny. You know?
Well, my wife and I, we were like under house arrest, it seemed like. But in the end, it was a wonderful experience being in Korea, despite being burnt in effigy in front of the U.S. Embassy.
Yeah, I was Ambassador Vershbau's political counselor, so I went through all this with him, and it was just unfathomable that when Koreans traveled to the U.S., the first thing they would do is eat a steak, you know, and then back in Korea, why they, you know, we're protesting so much. But anyways, Ambassador Stevens?
I just add, hopefully briefly, and not really so much about my own experience, but listening to this, I mean, obviously when I got to Korea, you know, I was very aware of the, sometimes people called it volatility, but of the importance of public opinion and how that plays out, and how sensitive the South Korean public is to everything that the Americans do, including American ambassadors. And you know, I lived in Korea in the 1970s when, you know, it was not democratized, and you know, and anything that was considered to be critical of Americans was also correlated with being kind of pro-North, and there was very little freedom of speech, if you like, but there was this very deep reservoir of people said to me, Helman Gwange, we had this alliance force in blood. I lived in the 80s, which is a whole other period where, again, the U.S. was front and center, and I you know, as I returned to Korea as ambassador, and I sorted these out, I heard some very wise words. I'm going to quote a former Korean ambassador to the U.S. and a former foreign minister, Han Sung-ju, whom I first met in the 1980s. And he came and actually talked to our embassy once, and you may remember this, Joe, and he asked for some lessons from his life, from his career. And a couple of things he said about the alliance. He said, and I'm just paraphrasing here, you know, he said that, I mean, first of all, the obvious thing we kind of know that you know, the United States looms a lot larger in Korea than Korea looms in the United States. And I mean, now it looms larger and in different ways, as Ambassador Cho pointed out, but that's just the case. The United States has played such an enormous role in what South Korea is today, you know, for better and worse. And he said, so anything involving the United States, he said, is not, in South Korea, don't think of it as a foreign policy issue, it's a domestic issue. And the press will treat it as a domestic issue. It is a domestic issue. And I think we saw that in this. It just turns into that. And moreover, the alliance, for all that it's an alliance forged in blood that has enjoyed great resilience and sustenance over time, it's unique in the sense that it's an alliance of one part of a country against this divided other part. And there's an inherent pain in that division. So the sort of national elements of that are always kind of lurking. So I think it does make it, of all the places I've served, you know, the U.S. looms pretty large in a lot of places, the most, in a way, satisfying because there's such a reservoir of connection that just, you know, is based in history but grows and manifests itself in different ways. But there's also, you know, a very sensitive and painful part of it, and in the sense that there's unfinished business. And we are so much a part of South Korea's modern journey that you just have to, especially in a democratic society, pay attention to where the public opinion is going.
So, I mean, as we all know, Ambassador Stevens is the only, so far, woman ambassador to South Korea.
So far. We'll change that.
You know? And
really
of course,
messed it up, huh?
you know,
You
her own Peace Corps experience. And I would ask people, and they would say they really liked her style, you know, that the regular person, Ajumma style, you know. But I told her, they like your Agashi style, you know. Yeah, you know.
No, well, Joe. Okay, so Joe, Joe was political counselor when talk about transitions. You know, he managed the relationship as Sandy departed and I arrived, and we discovered that Korean sauce is both from the same South Korean province of Chungcheongnam-do. Although I think I had a lot more affection for it than you expressed. So you know, so we used to tease each other about who was making the most mistakes in Korean.
So let's go to the most recent one, and Ambassador Harris.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I was ever accused of having a style that was appreciated by the Korean people. So I had the opportunity, challenge perhaps, of working for a very transactional and unconventional president. Right. And
here.
So, yeah. Not, I didn't work for. And that unconventionality and transactionalness, if that's a word, manifested itself in things like the Special Measures Agreement, the Burden Sharing Agreement, when President Trump asked for a 500% increase in financial contributory support by the Republic of Korea. If you believe some of the books that have been written after President Trump left office, some of those books describe how he wanted to tear up the KORUS completely and not renegotiate it, but get rid of it because he didn't like the free trade agreement with Korea. Fortunately, we were able to renegotiate it and not get rid of it outright. He and President Moon did not get along. That should come as no surprise. He had an unusual relationship with Kim Jong-un, love letters and all of that. A little unconventional there. And we dealt with, while I was there, the THAAD issue, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Missile System, and all the dramas surrounding that. There was an issue of a ship that had been attacked by Iranian terrorists, Republican Guard folks in the Middle East, and we had asked Korea and other countries to help us in sending assets to better patrol the Strait of Hormuz. That was a political issue, even surprisingly, when you consider that the ship that was attacked was South Korean, but that became an issue. So all of these issues were swirling about, and the Korean media and the like could not attack President Trump, and rightly so. The outcome could have been visceral, and it was a good thing they didn't attack President Trump. So they took out their anger at me, and that's expected. That's part and parcel of the job of an ambassador. But it manifested itself in things like 19 protesters actually breached the wall of the residence and were moving toward Habib House itself. And were it not for my crackerjack house staff, who's supposed to make the perfect drink and the perfect canapé for receptions, they fought them off. And they couldn't get into the house. The only previous time, twice in history, was the ambassador's residence in Seoul breached. It was during the Korean War when John Mucho was the ambassador, and later in the 1980s when Donald Gregg was the ambassador.
Nice, yeah.
And so they got over the wall there. They didn't have the hang me in effigy there on Wangan Square, but they did have the decapitate me event down there. Let's see, there was the calls from certain members of the National Assembly to P and G me, and so, but that's part and parcel of being an ambassador for an unpopular president in a country, even one as close and as an ally with us as South Korea. I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that captured my attention in the whole range of my time in Korea. Though I was there for 2.5 years. My wife and I loved being stationed in Korea, living in Seoul, and doing all the things that we got to do. We love that. But because of the nature of the question, how you phrased it, I focused on the negative aspects of it. But in the grand picture, it's so positive, and we miss living in Seoul to this day.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Harris. I think you heard some really interesting episodes here, but yet, you left Korea, Ambassador Harris, probably at the height of approval rating for the alliance, and I think that speaks to volumes about the strength of the alliance. And I want to go back to Ambassador Cho for last comments on why we've seen such increase in approval for the alliance by the Korean public over the last 2-3 decades.
Well, first of all, we bottomed out, and second of all, China.
That would talk.
I still remember. The Ambassador Herbert talked about this very tragic tragedy that happened in 2002. At that time, Korea has become more open and very noisy. That's natural. That's a good thing. Noisy and loud democracy ourselves. So for quite a while, the issues relating to the U.S. Korea alliance were not made public. So public basically were in the dark about all these issues. And some of the aspects of the stationing of USFK, of course, will cause uneasiness and among the Korean people, and naturally, it's kind of very logical. For example, what kind of electricity rate is being applied to USFK as compared to the Korean military forces. So there are two different rates, and Korean people didn't know that. So when that came out, then of course, why should it be that way? What I'm saying is that all these issues, and many of them are small issues relating to the stationing of USFK, who were kept in the dark for decades, and came out, and with the Korea turning into a more exciting democracy ourselves. That happened in the late 1980s and early 21st century. And many of the questions that have not been asked have been asked. And we have to have good answers to that, right? So when I say that this the approval rating of the alliance bottomed out, what I mean is that all these difficult times, I was in that myself, all these difficult times actually at the end of the day encouraged the Korean people to really think about the fundamental question, that is, so this alliance with the United States and this U.S. troop presence in Korea, is that a good thing? You are willing to, go ahead with it, or you don't prove it? So what I'm saying in the beginning, all these peripheral questions were asked, and then that led to the moment when Korean people are beginning to ask a more fundamental question. I think Korean people decided that having this alliance and having the continued troop presence in Korea are actually in the interest of my country. It's not because of U.S., not because of Japan, or not because of China. It's the interests of the Republic of Korea. I think that awakening or that decision was probably made sometime between the 2002 and maybe 2012 well, and anywhere between that. So that was a very important moment. And at the end of the day, I think this alliance, it was valuable and is valuable, and that value was recognized by the Korean people. The other thing, of course, is China. So I think the active diplomats are paid to be positive and optimistic and not taking a lot of issues. So maybe I should be a little more cautious than at the time I was member of National Assembly. But China, let me put it this way, when it comes to public diplomacy point of view, China could not have been worse than they did in the last 10 years vis-a-vis Korean people. So these days, when Korean Institute or American Institute take the polls, do you like China, do you like the United States? Well, say 20 years ago, I think probably like 60, 70% of my people will say, oh, I like China. But these days, that ratio has come down to between 25 and 35%. So what a dramatic shift. And it is more important in the sense that this trend is more pronounced in younger generations of Koreans rather than older generation Koreans. So when you look at the possible future trajectory, I think I cannot say it's good news to the alliance, but in a way that the way that China did pull in terms of public diplomacy, at least in my country, that I think helped turn the tide about Korean people's perceptions about the United States. And I'm just talking about the facts here.
Thank you very much. If I may just make one comment, that is our observation. When we talk about big visit summits like upcoming, we always talk about deliverables, and when I first worked, when I first went to Korea at the end of 90s, most of the deliverables were what could U.S. do for South Korea. But now the deliverables are about what can South Korea do for the U.S. What can we do in terms of investment in the U.S., big investment in batteries or chips? What can we do in terms of sending weapons to Ukraine, What can we do? So all this sort of balance is much more balanced. So I would say this is just a testimony of how far the alliance have come. The last comment I will make before turning over to Ambassador Stevens for her last words is, the American ambassador in Seoul are the face of the alliance, and their basic humanity and their basic desire to help. I think that just comes through during their tenure and afterwards. So really, I think both the Americans and Koreans owe a big debt of gratitude to them. Okay, so anyhow, Ambassador Stevens for some closing comments.
Oh goodness, I didn't expect. Well, I don't feel I should take advantage of this to add to some things that I've heard. There's so much we could talk about, and I hope we can do this again. I would say that, and I mean, a special thanks to you, Joe, for moderating this, and Ambassador Joe, thank you so much for inspiring us to do this. So maybe I'll use my last moment for a little bit of a KEI advertisement, and that is, as some of my colleagues on the stage know, about a decade ago, KEI published a book from former ambassadors, each contributing a chapter about managing the alliance, their assignment in Seoul, and their assignments in Washington, because we also have contributions from former Korean ambassadors to Washington, about, I think, 20 former ambassadors. We're updating that. We're going to be issuing it later this year, and I hope that will be an occasion where we can bring some of our Korean colleagues, whether remotely or in person, even better in person in Seoul and Washington. And but I think we're going to need more than one session. But I think maybe not everything that needs to be said has been said, but a lot has been said, but not yet by everybody. So we'll have to have another go at it. But thank you so much, and a special thanks to Ambassador Hill for his continued service and for joining us from Belgrade.
If I may, just one word. This book Ambassador Stevens is referring to is a book of the compilation of the chapters written by American ambassadors in Korea and Korean ambassador to Washington, D.C. I read several chapters. Surprisingly, this book is very entertaining. Because some of the chapters are like tell-all. Tell-all kind of chapters. So it's kind of very entertaining and worthwhile to read this. I should,
We'll invite you all
help
to
in
the
the
book launch.
advertisement.
Thank you. We'll invite you all. We'll make sure it's entertaining, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry. That was good, yeah. Boy, the memories go flooding back.